Welcome, everyone. My name is Bethany Servin, and I work in marketing here at UsableNet. We're so glad you could join us today. This webinar is part of our ongoing European Accessibility Act compliance series designed to help organizations prepare for the European Accessibility Act. Navigating EAA compliance can be complex, and our goal is to provide practical guidance to support your efforts. Today's session is the European Accessibility Act in Action, Practical Strategies for Compliance. So I'll go ahead and hand it off to our panelists to introduce themselves, starting at the top.
So yeah, I think at the top is me, right? So hello everyone, thrilled to be here. Thank you very much. Thrilled to speak about the EA today. My name is Patrick Born. I'm associate at the law firm Fieldfisher, located in Munich, in the Munich office of Fieldfisher, located in the practice group Commercial and Distribution Law, meaning we're supporting international companies on drafting and negotiating commercial contracts across the whole supply chain anyway, and also advising on e-commerce questions and regulatory matters such as general terms and conditions, withdrawal rights, and anything related to that, but also in the last years, the European Accessibility Act, which is the reason I'm here today. And yeah, over to you, Mo.
Hello, everyone. My name is Merel van Aar, and I'm an associate at Fieldfisher Amsterdam. I've been advising and litigating in intellectual property and all things related to technology and data for over 6 years. Over to Michele.
Thanks, Meryl. Yeah, my name is Michele Lucchini. I'm the Vice President for Product Management at UsableNet. So my role in the organization is to make sure that our product strategy is in line with the market and our customer needs. I've been working at UsableNet for about 25 years, and I cover many roles in the organization, and I'm very happy to be on this webinar, and I thank you everyone for joining.
Yes, so as I just mentioned, I'm advising and litigating on all things technology and data. And of course, I don't do this by myself, but I do this together with over 2,000 colleagues across 27 offices. And we are located in Europe, Silicon Valley, and China. So at Fieldfisher, we are a European law firm, mostly advising global businesses. And what we're seeing is truly an increase in technology regulation, which impacts many of our clients. And there's a lot of crossover as well between these regulations, and businesses need to approach them in whole. So this legal landscape includes what we are going to talk about today, a very important topic, accessibility. We've been supporting clients in understanding and implementing the European Accessibility Act, for example, by identifying which products or services are in scope, identifying roles in the consumer supply chain, helping them with updating accessibility statements and other policies and contracts, as well as understanding and navigating the wider legal landscape on technology regulation. And we really look forward to diving into this topic with you today.
So we'll start from the basis and get everyone on the same page on what the European Accessibility Act is. So its purpose, the scope, and which are the exemptions. Then we'll also spend some time on the compliance goals, and in particular, we'll also review together the first claim that after the European Accessibility Act being active have been noticed, and I think that that's an interesting case studies that we should discuss. And then we'll move to after the background and aligning on that, we'll move on with understanding from a practical point of view, which are the strategies to making sure that within your companies you are creating a digital accessibility program, understanding which are the technical requirements and how to migrate from treating accessibility as a one-off project that could work for the initial effort, how to make a sustainable program of work so accessibility is injected as part of your day-to-day and all the life cycle of your digital properties. And with that said, I think that I'll hand off to Meryl or Patrick, actually.
Yes, thank you very much, Michele. So I'm very happy because today we have people on the call from all over the world, including Europe, Hong Kong, India, Korea, and the US. And I myself am from a very small country, which is called the Netherlands. And on this slide, you see a photo I took from Utrecht Central Station on my way to work. And on the photo, you can see the train station is accessible. On the left, you can see a ramp. And then you can see more in the middle, a bicycle lane leading to one of the biggest bicycle sheds in the world. And as some of you may know, in the Netherlands, we love cycling. Then you can see an elevator, escalators, and stairs. And this all to sum up that the train station is accessible via many different ways to make sure that everyone can take the train. And this leads me to the next slide. What we find normal in the physical world rightly becomes more important in the online world as well. And an example is the use of auto caption on platforms such as TikTok and YouTube, and the captions that we are using here today as well in the webinar. Next, please. So in Europe alone, 80 million people live with a disability. And the purpose of the European Accessibility Act is to make Europe a more inclusive society by improving access to both products and services for people with disabilities. And my colleague Patrick is going to tell you a little bit more about this specifically means for e-commerce services.
Next slide, please. Yeah, thank you very much, Meryl. As Meryl just said, the general purpose of the EA is to make products and services that the European legislator identified to be of special importance for people with disabilities more accessible. And these are mostly digital products and digital services. And among these services, we can find in the EEA the wording that in scope, there are also the e-commerce sector, e-commerce services. And which sounds harmless at first glimpse, actually one of the broadest, if not the broadest scope or the broadest sector, which is in scope of the EA, because e-commerce services, actually any app or website which is provided with a view to a consumer contract. And with a view to a consumer contract does not necessarily only mean an app or website that sells something to a consumer online, but would also be an app or a website which merely has the intention to lead to a consumer contract at a later stage, for example, at a local store somewhere, and a consumer can merely book an appointment on the website to go and enter into a contract at the local store, for example, your local barber shop. And this leads to the fact that if an economic operator has an app or a website which is directed to consumers in the European Union, actually every such economic operator has at least to consider if it might be subject to the EEA and fall into its scope. So it's a very broad scope here regarding e-commerce services. And when we have customer clients that ask us questions about if they fall in scope, the next question will always be, okay, I understood it might be in scope, but do I have to make the whole website or the whole app accessible, or is it only like minor parts, like sales parts that are relevant to buy a product or to book an appointment? And this is something that might, of course, be also subject to local law, like to German law, French law, and Spanish law, and so on. But there is a general tendency that, at least from a German perspective and several other countries, it's more the whole website than it would be only the sales part. So in most countries, it is the safer bet to approach this on a broader, from a broader perspective and make the whole website accessible to be on the safe side rather than only sales parts. Under DA, there are some special exceptions for certain parts of websites and apps. As I just said, there are certain exceptions for service providers, like if you are, especially for apps or websites, for example, time-based recorded media services, and any office files are exempt if they are published before June 28, 2025. Meaning that if you have, for example, you have a website and there is a video on the website, or if you have a PDF file that where you explain how your product works or the service works that is sold online via the website, this does not have to be provided in an accessible form if it was uploaded before 28 June 2025. The other exceptions, I didn't actually want to talk about so much either way because it's very hard in detail to get to those exceptions. There is a general exception from EA compliance for websites and apps if you are a micro enterprise, meaning if the staff headcount is fewer than 10 employees and you're under total million annual turnover. The problem is most of the companies that are active throughout Europe and throughout the world, they don't fall under this exception. And then there are two other exceptions listed here: the disproportionate burden and the fundamental change to the service. The problem is that it's very hard to make them work. And if you're trying to make them work, it should be done with the right approach. And it might also depend on the country you're located in or the country you're directing your services to. So we're advising clients in this area on a daily basis, but it is hard to make it work. And if it's done, it should not be done just like that, but in connection with a local council that tells you how to make some exceptions like this work regarding products or services. And on to the last slide for my part, the compliance slide. Thank you. We've spoken a lot about scope and exceptions and so on. And now it's the question, of course, what do I have to do to make my service, my website, my app compliant? What does the EA tell me what I have to do? The problem is the EA itself doesn't tell you much because it's very abstract. It talks about operable, making a website or service operable, understandable, robust, and perceivable. Of course, it makes sense if you read it, but it doesn't tell you anything how to make the website or the app in any kind accessible. It doesn't tell you how to do things. So even more so, it is subject to implementation into national law. It's a EU directive, so it must be implemented by every member state into its own legislations. So there can be deviations between the member states, which is also very complicated. And here we have EN 301-549, which is your friend when it comes to material compliance with the EEA. And material compliance means what do I have to do to make my website or my app accessible? Michele will tell you much more about EN 301-549 and how it works, and it's a technical framework on a later stage. But which is important is that if you are compliant with EN 301-549, if the app or the website is compliant with it, it will likely be compliant EU-wide. So the material aspect of compliance with the EA is based on EN 301-549. But the most important thing that I want to say here is that there are formal aspects of EA compliance which should not be forgotten. Like, it's not only making a website or an app accessible, but there's also documentation obligations. And there's an accessibility statement, which is a statement that has to be published on the app or the website to tell economic operators what to do, in which the economic operators tell the authorities, but also consumers what they do, what provisions are applicable to them, and so on. And they are much more dependent on local law and require much more local counsel and should be developed with a strategy. If you're, for example, active in more than one European country, should be developed with a certain strategy. And that's something we work with a broad European network. It's called the European EA Desk, which sits in several European countries to help clients to do so. Thank you very much. Over to you, Meryl.
Yes. Of course, another question we receive a lot from clients is if we already see the consequences of non-compliance and enforcement, and they usually ask us about fines. So, of course, but the companies who don't comply with the EAA could be fined. And because the EAA is a directive, and as Patrick already pointed out, these fines can differ per country. So my European colleagues and I did a mapping exercise to identify, so to speak, the different regulators and the differences in rules relating to enforcement on a national level. We discovered in Spain and Luxembourg, for example, fines are on the higher end. But fines are just one aspect of the consequences of non-compliance, or the potential consequences, better said. But there are many other options as well. For example, there could be claim or cease and desist letters, and we will discuss an example of this in the next slide. The distribution of products and services that do not comply may be prohibited altogether in case of non-compliance. And of course, other associated risks are loss of reputation. If, for example, there will be media attention, or there will be a court case, and there could be liability claims, mediation, or litigation proceedings. And now on the next slide, we will zoom in a little bit on an example. So there are two French associations for the visually impaired that sent formal legal notices to four big retail companies. Users of the websites could not choose, for example, this was, by the way, a website of a supermarket, and the user could not choose the click and collect delivery method, and this method is for free. And instead, the user was forced to use the paid delivery option due to inaccessibility of the websites. And other than that, it was mentioned by users that they were unable to tick certain boxes, they were unable to navigate between different sections, and that the lack of contrast on the websites was problematic for them as well. And in the statement of the French associations, they emphasize that a non-accessible interface for a person with visual impairment is as problematic as someone in a wheelchair facing a staircase, as their only option to enter, for example, as we've seen in the beginning, a train station. And if we would see this happening in real life, like a train station, only stairs, and you would see someone in a wheelchair in front of those stairs, like everyone would immediately understand that this is very problematic and that something should be done. But for digital accessibility, sometimes it's less clear for people that this is happening and that this is as important. So the associations demanded the supermarkets and the retail companies to make their online services accessible. And if not, the companies will be summoned to court. This demonstrates that failure to comply with EAA is already starting to result in legal actions, and we will continue to watch this space and update through our EAA desk website. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Meryl, for all the insight that you gave us. Let's start talking about the strategies that every company should consider to implement within their organization. So, I mean, first of all, is identifying the scope and who is supposed to do what. Um, for the benefit of this webinar, let's consider one example that everybody can understand. So we need to make a website accessible. So first of all, we need to understand who works on the website. The accessibility can be considered at a different level in order to simplify, and actually we are simplifying but not trivializing. We should consider the design level, the content level, and the code level. Who is working or helping or is responsible of the property at each of these levels? Am I using third parties? What the contract are saying, the contract that I have with the third parties, are they supposed to provide me with accessible or a compliant solution? Were they responsible to provide me with accessible design? So it's good to know, do a sort of census of all these aspects in order to understand who is responsible or who was supposed to be responsible to guarantee the accessibility of the website, if there was any. The second important point is decide how to execute. These are obviously might need an intermediate step, which is normally the result of an expert doing an audit to understand where you are and what's the condition of the property. But how this will be remediated, how the audit will be remediated. Am I using my third parties? Is it something I'll have to involve internal resources to do? Shall I do an audit by myself? Do I want an accessibility expert as a partner? So understand which are the main actors to understand where we are and remediate the existing solution. The third step is implement an accessibility program. I alluded to that before when I was going through the agenda. And we'll see in the following slide how this is very relevant, in particular with the European Accessibility Act. The obvious step is remediate a existing digital property that is not fully accessible or not fully compliant. But that is an initial step that we need to do. Then probably the most interesting part of the journey, and I would say also probably the most challenging one, is how I can guarantee the maintenance of the remediation status I have achieved. So how I can keep the accessibility status to the highest possible value on the property that I remediated. And that is where I build an accessibility program. A routine of test, prioritization of accessibility matters, how to monitor the conformance score, how to maintain accessibility over time, which translates in not just in doing things, but translate immediately into changes to the processes that regulate the life cycle of the property I need to make accessible. And this is probably the biggest step that the companies are taking, because the initial remediation, like we said before, can be just a project. You hire your expert, you hire your third-party vendor, your agency, and pretty much you can, if you have focus, if you have the right people to work on, you will reach a goal. But an overtime maintenance of accessibility very often goes in contrast with business goal, with the goals that are the typical nature of the business. Imagine to be a luxury retailer. A luxury retailer will never prioritize, or will be very complicated for a luxury retailer to prioritize accessibility on top of other revenue drivers. So it needs to be a process evolution together with also a cultural evolution, which normally are the aspects that are pretty challenging to implement. But if the company implements those things, then accessibility becomes extremely more sustainable over time. And then the last point is all about the communication. In this slide, we mentioned the accessibility statement or the policy, but also the communication that is done internally to an organization. So the communication that you implement, so the policy that you implement in order to communicate to all teams, which are the goals, which are the requirements for accessibility within the organization, are definitely aspects that are essential because, like I'm sure you understood hearing me talking, accessibility is not just a matter that involves one single team. It involves many different teams within the organization, and the more know which are the company goals, the easier it will be to generate and build this accessibility culture within a company, which is the root for making accessibility sustainable. Like Patrick was saying before, while the European Accessibility Act is quite generic in terms of the specifics and telling us what we have to do, the European Accessibility Act indeed comes together with a technical guideline, which is called EN 301549, which mirrors the Web Content Accessibility Guideline in its version 2.1 AA, which is the worldwide standard for digital accessibility. It is interesting to notice that there is already an updated version of the European guideline to mirror the 2.2 AA. So our recommendation is to focus and set as a guideline to comply with the 2.2 instead of the 2.1, because sooner or later that will be the reference you will have to consider. So this to me represents potentially a good news, because I'm pretty sure that many that are attending this webinar today already got in touch with accessibility because of their presence in the United States. We know that the United States is a pretty active country from a legal point of view around accessibility matters. And if you want to create a protection layer against the legal threat in the United States, obviously you're already trying to do your best effort in order to implement a website that is complying with the Web Content Accessibility Guideline. So is the same in Europe. So from a technical point of view, the guideline is exactly the same. Probably it was probably not enough complicated for Europeans to just reference to that guideline, and we wanted to create an additional documentation that is exactly the same, but indeed there is no difference. Something that is extremely interesting, at least in my opinion, and the biggest difference between the American with Disability Act and the European Accessibility Act is that with the European Accessibility Act, the importance of the compliance of the digital property, so the adherence to the technical requirements, so the adherence to the EN 31549, is as important as the ability to demonstrate that you have processes, you have defined processes in order to guarantee that accessibility is a requirement across all the steps of the delivery life cycle that regulates the genesis and the life of your digital properties. So this can go under the name or the concept of digital maturity around accessibility. And in the European Accessibility Act, this concept is emphasized pretty well. So the recommendation is, and also the requirement from the European Accessibility Act, is to keep the documentation that shows and describes your processes in terms of what you are doing for accessibility. So documenting and demonstrating that, for example, as part of the design phase, you actually have a design review of your mockups, description of what you do at the code level. So which are the checks that the developers are implementing, which are the sanity checks that you might be doing before going live, which are the tests that are happening once the release, the website or the changes are deployed into production, how you monitor the production version of your website. So all these things are part of the process-oriented compliance that you should document. So as I was mentioning, is about of process, right? And if we consider what could be a meaningful workflow to embed accessibility into the life cycle of a digital property, it is a matter of implementing a loop. It is not as always as simple as a loop, but you should have you should see it as the milestones, the important milestones of this journey as a continuous loop. So On an annual basis, at least you should have an audit, so a compliance audit, fulfilling all the success criteria and requirements of the guideline that you are considering to understand what's left to remediate. Having a procedure to remediate the audit and build all the evidence that the audit occur and that the remediation occur. Update your accessibility statements. Like Patrick was saying, there are countries in Europe that might require specific accessibility statement that can be also very detailed in terms of the non-conformances. So while you fix and remediate, you might need to update these accessibility statements in order to reflect the results that you got. And then obviously the loop includes also the constant and continuous monitoring of your digital property, because there are many actors that potentially could publish content or functionality, and you need to make sure that every time something changes, the accessibility level that you set as a target is guaranteed across your website. In terms of standards, we already said before, right? The standard for the European Accessibility Act is this guideline called EN 301549, but aligns with the Web Content Accessibility Guideline. And I mean, despite the recommendation on this slide, actually, we suggest to follow the 2.2 AA because that will come soon. And let's make sure that you are aware of the local regulations on the different countries of the European community. Italy, France, Germany, they have some restrictive requirements, for example, in terms of the accessibility statement. So make sure that you are aware about those, and you can build an accessibility statement, in this case, that is in line with those requirements. The good news is that there is no European country that set more restrictive technical requirements. There is no country asking you to follow the 2.2 AAA, for example. So in terms of technical requirements, they are all very much aligned. The differences might be in the documentation that you have to provide upon request, or you have to publish on your website. And and then I think the third milestone is building all the documentation that you can that can prove your diligence in adopting accessibility as a requirement, and this might start with the website, but then needs to extend also to documents such as PDFs or other documents that you might have on your website and you might allow to download from your website. Plus documenting all the activities that you are doing. Trainings, monitoring reports, third-party audits. So, for example, I'm working with a third-party agency. Let's imagine that I'm using on my retailer website, I'm using a third-party, let's say, widget to manage all the product reviews. Document your request, for example, to your vendor in terms of accessibility guarantees. The vendor should provide you with the VPAT, which is the voluntary product accessibility template that tells you that this widget I'm telling you and you can inject on, I'm giving you and you can inject inside your website is accessible. The European Accessibility Act allows you to use widgets that are not accessible, and you are not responsible if they are not. But ideally, you should use all. You should select widgets and vendors that are accessible. So document all this process. Document all the information and reports that can give you, so you can build this library related to accessibility. In order to create an effective testing program in accessibility, we need to rely on two aspects. One is the automation. happily, we can rely on automation. Automation can cover a good gap in terms of accessibility testing. Automation is an excellent fit during the development, during part of the quality assurance phase, in order to perform regression monitoring once we go live with something new. But accessibility cannot be fully tested automatically. There is an important heavy lifting that needs to be done from a manual point of view. The majority of the success criteria of the Web Content Accessibility Guideline, or the EN 301549, requires an expert that reviews manually if the success criteria are satisfied or not. So I want to make this concept very clear. Automation is important, can be an excellent tool, but will never be enough to monitor and to determine the accessibility of a website. These manual verifications can be part of the audit, can be part of your regular testing program involving also the disabled community, so providing any news feedback, but are essential in order to keep the accessibility at a meaningful level. I'm not going through the details of this slide, as we'll be sharing the deck after the webinar. You will find this slide that could be an interesting takeaway. It is the analysis of how to better balance test automation and manual testing. So probably we'll go very quick on this one because it's a concept that I probably already presented at least high level before. If we think about the life cycle of a digital property, the design could be considered as the first step, and design is a big driver for accessibility. If we think about the native apps, design and UX is actually one of the biggest drivers for accessibility, because at code level, the control that you might have on a native app in terms of accessibility is not as big as on the website. But design is the first initial step where you start building accessibility. So make sure that you perform accessibility review at the design phase, that you involve design agencies that have experience in accessibility. The second step is coding. Let's make sure that your development team has skills and knowledges on accessibility, and they know how to produce accessible code. Let's make sure they have the right technologies, the right tools, such as, for example, linters and ways to check the single components while they code. So everything that help in keeping the code as clean as possible from an accessibility point of view. Don't forget about content. Content is another big vehicle for accessibility. And with the evolution of the browser, with the future maybe of the way we will browse website, also thanks to the AI agents, content will be more and more important in terms of accessibility. So let's make sure that your content authors have tools, technologies to do tests before they publish their content. Let's make sure that you build best practices internally to regulate the content generation for your website, but why not also for your narrative beside the website? There are best practices, for example, that regulates the accessibility of your social media presence. That is all part of an incremental cultural around accessibility that you will be benefit if implemented in this way. And last but not least, all the quality assurance phase and the monitoring. So rely on automated scans, but also involve experts and the disabled community with user testing in order to do regular checks of your website and keep accessibility under control. I think that we already pretty much cover this in the previous slides, but it's important to obviously have a accessible property, but it's equally important to build a library of evidence of what you're doing. So the most recent audit, the processes that you're implementing in order to control accessibility, um, making sure that you build a structure within the organization where you have clear responsibles for accessibility. And and one of the aspects that often is underestimated is the importance to create also rules in terms of prioritization of the accessibility matter. So when an accessibility issue is highlighted, what should we do? Which is the flow that we should consider following in terms of the classification of the priority, classification of the assignment of who should be responsible for resolving the issue, and so on and so forth. And in terms of the best practices, we said in multiple ways, accessibility is not enough. So we should consider to involve manual testing in our process. Accessibility should not also be considered like a one-off, should not be itemized. And you need to think about the entireness of the guideline to make sure that you're fulfilling all the requirements. And again, probably repeated 100 times today, but this is because we believe so much in this. Focus on process, not just the technical goal, not just doing stuff, but focus on process. It needs to be sustainable.
We had quite a few questions come in, so I'll go ahead and get us started here. Um, this is an interesting one. Is it true that the accessibility statement has to be delivered in the official language of the market where a company is doing business in? So if the website offers services to customers in all EU countries, do we need to offer this statement in 27 languages?
I can take with that one real quick. So my first question, like back here, would be if the contract is actually, it's possible to conclude a contract with a consumer in 27 languages, because this might also depend a little on local the consumer protection law of the different member states. But at least from a German perspective, we would argue that if like as a general principle, if a contract can be concluded in German, then the contract details like general terms and conditions and likely also the general the accessibility statement will have to be provided in German language from a consumer protection point of view, which the EA is aimed at. So it might surely depend on if you also offer your services in 27 languages throughout the EU, if that explains a little bit.
Meryl, oh, it looks like you're answering this one. What are the fines that a company could receive? I believe you touched on this during your presentation a little bit.
Yeah, I think it's very different per country, but we've written Patrick and I actually written a blog post about this with an overview of the different options per country. And I think we had another interesting, sorry, I see all the questions. I have to see if I can find it. We had another interesting question about the e-commerce definition as well. And if
I see it. Can you talk about the legal definition of e-commerce? They mentioned that e-commerce sites must be EAA compliant, but does this also apply to a site without product sales? For example, a store's website where services are offered in store without any purchase or reservations being made on the site.
Yeah, so this is a question we've been getting more from clients. And if we look at the legal definition of e-commerce within the European Accessibility Act, like the formal definition is that it's services provided at a distance through websites, mobile device-based service by electronic means, and at the individual request of a consumer with a view to concluding a consumer contract. So this is the formal legal definition. But going back to this question in a more practical way, It says like that the e-commerce that it applies to a site without product sales. And actually, this could, in our view, be seen as a mere, depends of course on the situation, but it could sometimes be seen as a mere presentation of the website and therefore or fall outside of the scope of the EAA. If nothing is sold and no appointment for an on-site sale can be booked, this this will likely mean that it's not within the scope of the EAA.
Who are the main stakeholders in a business who will be aware of the EAA and needing to manage these changes?
Probably, I mean, I can try to take it. I think it will also be interesting from Michele's perspective, because this is actually that's the purpose we're here as lawyers and I think technical service providers, because this is exactly what I think is relevant, that we have EEA requires a combination of legal advice and technical expertise here. So I would say both the legal department together with technical department, technical service providers. I don't know what your perspective on that would be, Michele.
Yeah, well said, Patrick. Uh, Normally, accessibility is such a broad topic within an organization that, I mean, the easiest answer would be it probably involves everyone. In terms of ownership, legal and compliance and IT are the three musketeers of accessibility. Um, Often, what we do with our clients is building inside the organization what is called a center of excellence of accessibility that involves people from different departments that can then orchestrate the activities within their teams. I like to think about, to give you an analogy about accessibility, as what you do for digital security. So it's very similar in terms of requirements, and probably also the establishment of a group of people that regulates the activities is very similar. So with digital security, you might have the involvement of the legal team, you have the IT, you have the architecture team, you have then everybody in the organization being aware about which are the security goals, which are the security concerns. Everybody does training on security. I'm sure you all do the trainings on digital security and phishing and stuff like that. Accessibility is very similar, so you should think about accessibility in that way.
Yes, I think this is completely right, and you can also build on the structures that are already in place for compliance with other legal frameworks, such as, for example, the GDPR and the AI Act, the Data Act, which is now very important. There's also a lot of overlap between those regulations, and it's good to have really one strategy for all of these regulations that combines them.
Yeah, I'm reading another question that it relates to an answer we already gave, but I think it's important to mention. So the question says, you mentioned that some countries have specific statement requirements for multinational website. How do you publish one statement that covers all these, particularly when the statement template refers to national legal requirements? That's an interesting one. I'll start, but then I'll need to rely on Meryl and Patrick to keep me honest and provide the legal advice. So I'm not a lawyer, so I might say something that is too practical. It's actually something that we face, I would say, on a weekly basis in UsableNet, and what we decided to do, at least the decision we took to address these things, is to have one fit all accessibility statement, but produce PDF documentation that are fulfilling the statement requirements for all the different European countries these clients of ours are operating in. So, for example, I have the statement that is a good common denominator between the different European country statements requirements. that fits all. But then I have the PDF with the Italian Declaration of Accessibility, which is the name of the government agency regulating accessibility in Italy decided to give to the statement. I have the RGAA, which is the template that in France is required to create. And I either keep them or we suggest our clients to keep them and provide upon request, or to, at the end of the accessibility statement page with the kind of generic language, add the link to download the specific statement. I don't know if this is a meaningful practice. I definitely want to turn this question back to Patrick and Meryl.
Yeah, thank you, Michele. I think this is definitely an interesting one, and this is so typical. What we see, this European regulation aiming to harmonize everything, making it easy for companies, and then in practice we see that regulators are behaving differently, even if we are looking at the same rules, and that are quite some deviations on the national level in the end, especially with the directive. So. Yeah, I think that as Michele mentioned rightly, like the technical perspective and like the common part, the main part of the accessibility statement can be the same. But then, yeah, on a national level, you need to amend some things. For example, the regulating authority and yeah, some other aspects as well. So, but the main part of the accessibility statement can be the same, and then there need to be some deviations on the national level.
Exactly. I mean, I think there's also a lot of movement in the market right now. And then I think what we have to keep in mind is that the EA is a rather new thing here. So it came into force on 28th June 2025 in most countries, meaning there's a lot of development. For example, in Germany, our authority has not even yet been like really created. It's just about to pick up its work. So we will see how the different authorities in different countries will start working. We'll start to see things. But there, as a general, you could say there's like two ways to say to keep it with the statement, the requirements of one country, the country of origin, the country you're located in, and probably adapted in several languages or something like that. But keep the requirements of one country. The others say, which would be the safest, the more safer way to put it, to add the requirements of every country you direct your services to, the country of destination, so to speak. And then, of course, the authority can check, and the consumer can see in its language as well, and the authority can check if the requirements are fulfilled here. So that would, of course, be the safer bet. But either way, when it comes to accessibility statements, it's a legal statement, and I think it's quite important that to make sure to have an approach that is somewhat safeguarded by some legal expertise here, and that you know what kind of risks you go with either way of approach, and to be able to access that. I think that would be. And of course, to monitor, one last word, to monitor how the different authorities in the EU are going to handle this in the future. I just saw the one that the question about if it is advisable to mention in an accessibility statement if someone is not compliant, any non-compliance issues, and it's certainly something that needs to be discussed also on a risk-based approach, because on the one side you're telling the public how you're not compliant. On the other hand, you might it might be brought to you that you're trying to hide something. So these are the two lines to follow here to keep in mind, and to have a certain risk-based approach when choose if you should mention it or not. But the law does not require you, in Germany at least.
And there's one that is interesting and maybe involves also Maron and Patrick expertise. Are the same implication of the European Accessibility Act the same on video games as with other type of applications? This is very interesting, right? Because we always need to consider the nature of the digital property we are considering. if the video game is meant to be a visual experience, it doesn't necessarily need to change completely its nature and be transformed into a video game that is available for blind people. But can definitely be improved in terms of accessibility for motor disabled people, for example. So it means that, yes, everything applies, but consider the nature. I'm doing a very silly analogy, but nobody will sue a car company because cars cannot be driven by blind people. The nature of the car requires people should be able to see. So it depends on the video game. One of our clients build video games and entertainment games for cruise ships, and they are making a big effort in order to make as accessible as possible without changing the nature of the video game. So the analysis and the requirements analysis in terms of the specific way accessibility would apply to that video game is essential to understand what to do. I don't know if Meryl and Patrick want to add something about that.
Yeah, probably just real quick. I mean, as you said, it's like probably a subject of fundamental change, right? Some of these exception parts to assess, and that's something we also do on a let's say almost daily basis. Is like, I mean, of course, you're not obliged to change your service to make it accessible if it's not the service anymore in the end, and but there needs to be documentation. Done why you choose to let out certain aspects of accessibility and why it's would be a fundamental change. But yeah, totally agree, Michaela.
And that concludes today's webinar.